My name is Bjorn Skaptason. We are webcasting tonight from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. We always do. We haven't been on the road for quite some time, but welcome to Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. We have two fine authors with us tonight and a couple of great books, and one I think is a groundbreaking book, a groundbreaking study, and that's why I get to do the interviewing tonight, because I like the Battle of Shiloh. It's one of my topics. First author we have with us tonight, Timothy B. Smith, and his book, Shiloh, Conquer or Perish. Now, Dr. Smith is the author of more than a dozen Civil War books on Civil War topics. Most notable, this great battlefield of Shiloh, Champion Hill, Mississippi in the Civil War, the home front, and Corinth, 1862, siege, battle, and occupation. Tim teaches history at the University of Tennessee, Martin, and worked as a ranger at the Shiloh National Military Park for about 7 years. So he is intimately familiar with all of the terrain, all of the hills and all of the valleys and all of the ravines there at Shiloh. You're going to love this book. We're going to have a really great conversation about Shiloh, about the Battle of Shiloh. But also with us today, someone who is also an expert on Shiloh. So we're going to see if we can get to the book you wrote, John, if we don't get too involved in the actions of April 6 and 7, 1862. But John F. Marszalek has joined us with Lincoln and the Military. And it is Southern Illinois University Press, part of their concise Lincoln Library, 168 pages. A brief look at Lincoln and his relations with the military, $24.95. Dr. Marszalek is the Giles Distinguished Professor Emeritus, Director and Mentor of Distinguished Scholars, and Executive Director and Managing Editor of the Ulysses S. Grant Association at Mississippi State University. He's the author of many books and articles, but most significantly, the most important biography of General William T. Sherman, Sherman, A Soldier's Passion for Order, also the author of Commander of All Lincoln's Armies, The Life of General Henry W. Halleck, and many other titles. I should also mention Shiloh, Conquer or Perish by Timothy B. Smith is by University Press of Kansas. 624 pages with maps and illustrations and photographs. The cost is $34.95. If you wish to order either of these books while we are talking about them, please do so. We'll get you a signed copy and we will ship them right out to you. So with all of that out of the way, welcome Tim Smith and John Marszalek to virtual book signing. And thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Thanks.
Tim, I want to start with you. As a woman that we met today at another event asked you, why Shiloh?
Well, and we talked about that's a program that you and I both did at Shiloh, an interpretive program. That was dealing more with why the battle happened at the site that it did. Yeah. I suppose you're talking about why did I write the book on
Why did you write a
Shiloh?
book on Shiloh? Yeah.
There are several other major works on Shiloh, of course, by major historians like Wiley Sword and Larry Daniel and James Lee McDonough and others. And my effort is not to downplay those. Those are very good books and they hit different angles. But I wanted to do two major things in this book. One is to kind of hone in on the terrain and the importance of the terrain on the fighting. And it's my contention that you really can't understand a battle unless you understand the battlefield. And all the years of work on the park, of course, aided in that. And really the best source I had for writing this book was the battlefield itself. And that, of course, necessitates battlefield preservation and the importance of that and so on. The other major thing that I wanted to do in this book was to really explore the second day. A lot of the other books deal just mostly on the first day, so I really wanted to hit the second day a lot, and really about half the book or half the battle text is on the second day, and I just found it fascinating.
It is a different read, and all these other titles that you acknowledged are great books. Wiley Sword's book has been a standard since the 1970s.
40 years, yeah.
Yeah, but just as a matter of counting, I counted the chapter titles in Sword's Shiloh Bloody April this morning as 3 chapters on the second day of the battle. Shiloh, Conquer or Perish has 8, count them, 8 chapters that in some way cover the second day of fighting. So if anybody out there has been wanting that book that dealt with the second day, this is it. John Marszalek, welcome. Thank you for coming to Virtual Burst.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I know that our friend Sylvia at SIU Press would have wanted you to write this book, and your answer to your question, why did you write the book, might be that Sylvia asked you to. And she's created a remarkable concise Lincoln Library series. But when she asked you, or when you talked about it, what made you want to write about Lincoln in the military?
That's a good question, because she did. She asked me, and it was at I think it was Southern Historical Association meeting, and we were talking about the series. She said, "Why don't you do something on Lincoln in the military?" And I said, "Oh, I didn't know if I would, have the time to do it or not." But my wife Jean was there too, and she and Sylvia ganged up on me basically and said, "You want to do this?" So of course I decided to do it. But going back beyond that, it was in 1997 that I first met Chief Justice Frank Williams and Harold Holzer, who run the Lincoln, the Lincoln Forum, or the leaders of the Lincoln Forum. And that's really got me interested in Lincoln. I joined the Lincoln Forum, and I started thinking about Lincoln much more than I ever did before. And so when I did make the decision to write this book, I think a lot of it goes back to those days at the Lincoln Forum. Every year going there and talking to other historians and talking to people who come who just love the subject of Lincoln. And I just decided, that this is something I do want to do. And I decided to do it. And as a result, I've dedicated the book to the Lincoln Forum and the people I've met through the Lincoln Forum. So that's a long, involved story, but it was a great experience.
Right. But it does bring us to the idea of Lincoln and the military. And I want to give you the first question that we've been thinking about here. President Lincoln does not have much military experience before his election. He has some, just the Black Hawk War experience. But how did his limited experience benefit him when it came to conducting this war, the Civil War?
Yeah, that's. I think that you've hit a key element there, and it's hard to imagine this, that being ignorant of basic military theory, because as you said, he didn't have much experience. But I think what's even more important is that he recognized that, and he recognized that he had to learn. And I think the important thing about the fact that he didn't know much about the military, but he also recognized that fact, and the result was that he did as much study as he could. He talked to as many people as he could, and he really looked to the generals. And ironically, as the war went on, instead of the generals teaching him, he began to teach the generals. He grew that much. And I think that's the thing. The humility had to recognize he didn't know all that much, and then the desire to learn and the dedication to get it done.
And the confidence that he knew something once he'd learned it.
Once he'd
mastered it.
That's
he
right.
was a master of
that
topic.
Exactly.
Very different than Jefferson Davis, right?
Right. Yeah, I was going to say, because Jefferson Davis was someone who had a lot of experience, but the difficulty was he really believed that he knew more than all his generals. He knew more than just about anybody else. If only he had become a general, he and Lee would have swept the Union off the field. And that makes it difficult. It makes it hard, because then you don't learn.
Right. Now, at the beginning of the war, another one for you, John. At the beginning of the war, a few of the people that became Civil War generals, Union generals, were acquainted with Lincoln, and Lincoln was acquainted with them before the war. Did this standing of familiarity with people like George B. McClellan, whom he'd met, or John McClernand, did that affect his judgment on their abilities? Maybe early in the war, maybe he changed later in the war.
Yeah. I don't think so. I think what he did, he looked at, for example, Winfield Scott. Now, Winfield Scott was universally considered the great American military mind of the 19th century, and McClellan was universally considered one of the great military minds. So I'm not so sure that it was that the fact that he knew them, but the fact that he was smart enough to find out just who out there is capable, or do people think is capable of being the general that I can throw into this battle and will help us win this war. Now it's true, and I think this may be where his weakness is a weakness, because he doesn't know, and he's got to do a lot of trying. He's got to try different people, and somebody like McClellan just doesn't work out. And again, it may be this thing that Tim pointed out with Jefferson Davis. McClellan knew the answers before the questions were being asked, so that was a difficulty. But I don't think the familiarity played that much of a role. Not as much, for example, as Davis and Braxton Bragg or one of these other people. Yeah.
Tim, I think anybody who's interested in Shiloh probably already accepts the idea that in order to understand a battle, you must walk the battlefield. You must go on the battlefield. But there's a difference between that. How does living on the battlefield, how did being there every day and walking there every day, doing programs for different people, how did that affect your appreciation of terrain over and above if you'd gone 10 times and spent 20 hours?
Right. Yeah. Well, obviously, the more you're on the battlefield, the more you learn about it, and there are different layers or levels that you can utilize on a battlefield. If you drive around the tour route, you don't get much of an understanding of where hills are or anything. If you go around the battlefield tour route on a bicycle, you start to understand a little more of that. If you walk it, you understand even more. If you get off the tour route and start really getting into the ravines and the creeks and so on, it just unfolds a whole lot more layers of terrain and so on. Living there, of course, and working there, you had unfettered access. Of course, everybody does. It's an open national park, but you have a great deal of access that leading the tours, and a lot of people want tours off the beaten path, and you have to figure out, and really one of the places you learn is people asking questions. People come into the front desk and ask questions, and you look up answers, and you go out on the battlefield and find out and examine, and that's a good place to learn. So, the time spent on the battlefield is absolutely priceless in understanding a battle.
Do you, and I think you'd be following in Cunningham's wake on this, do you actually use the battlefield and the battlefield tablets and that text as a primary source? Absolutely. And does it appear in the footnotes? And
I cite a lot of the tablets and monuments and so on. Not necessarily, of course, they are primary sources in the sense that the veterans themselves put them there and wrote that text, but they're not April 1862 primary sources. They're 30 years later. So I primarily use the contemporary April 1862 material, but I would also use, obviously, the historian, the first historian, David W. Reed, was able to know a lot more than we could ever glean from those letters or diaries or reports, because he could actually talk to the veterans themselves and wade through conflicting reports to find out, what probably is the best case scenario or what happened and so on. So they're an invaluable source as well.
Okay.
Could I just jump in
there
too, because I think Tim, and this is not taking away from anybody else who's been working at Shiloh and interpreting Shiloh, but I think he gives as good a tour as anybody that you can imagine. And the thing I most remember is this idea of terrain, when he took a group of us in a tour group, basically, and took us into the Dills Creek area right before Grant, in front of Grant's final line. And you can read about it and all the rest, but he took us down into it.
Yeah.
And we walked down and then walked up. And if anybody has any doubts about, what would have happened had that Confederates and Beauregard said, "Yeah, we're going to attack there," it would be pretty obvious. So I think that's why this book is so significant too, because it does point out things like that. So when somebody goes there, they can do it themselves, even if they don't want to go with him because he's not doing this anymore. But he can still follow that and can learn in other areas in the field too.
Right. And I certainly I agree with you that having done it myself, that the battlefield tour is a form historical form that ought to be taken very seriously, and the people that do it ought to hold their program to a high standard of scholarly inquiry.
Sure.
And you can't do footnotes, but you should at least be able to tell people why you're saying what you say.
Well, you can. I've done tours and carry the photocopied reports, and, and stop at different areas and read what they said happened there. So a lot of different interesting ways.
In the not too distant future, we'll have everybody will be out there with a tablet, and you can actually give them their footnotes.
Yeah, right. That's right. Right.
Now, more on terrain. How does terrain play a role in this narrative? And I'm thinking, I'll grab your book and open it so you can show it. But this hourglass concept that you were talking about today at the Union League Club, that's a new look at the terrain that the previous writing has not illustrated. And I'm going to try to find that while Tim talks about it.
Okay, I think most historians dealing with Shiloh go to a certain level of terrain awareness, and most of the time that deals with the Tennessee River and the larger creeks that form the battlefield, the parameters of the battlefield, as I call it: Snake Creek, Owl Creek, Lick Creek, and those are all important. Obviously, they form this cul-de-sac in which the battle is fought. But I'm convinced that the smaller creeks, Tillman Branch, Shiloh Branch, Locust Grove Branch, Deal Branch, that transact the battlefield, are really more important in determining how the battle was fought and where things happen that stall the fighting or push the fighting and so on. So these secondary creeks really are much more important in determining where the battle goes and so on. In this hourglass thing, the battlefield of Shiloh is basically divided into two halves, and they're joined by a narrow stretch in the middle. A couple of these creeks kind of eat into this high ground, and it makes basically an hourglass. And the vast majority of the Battle of Shiloh and the heaviest fighting is on the southern half of that hourglass. So it's a good way. Everybody knows what hourglass is, so it's a good way to kind of illustrate that in people's minds, I think.
So the battlefield is pinched in the middle when you look at it from north to south, and our folks at home got to see the map that you made. And the heaviest fighting is concentrated in the bottom of that, and the Confederates ultimately could not get across into the top half of the hourglass. Viewers, if you want to send me all the questions, that's great. I've got pages of questions I can ask these guys, but you're watching, and if you have any questions, please send them in. But Larry from Linden, Michigan asks, and this is going to open a can of snakes. Let's put the worms right out on the table here. Then it's for Tim. Tim, was Grant surprised at Shiloh by the misuse of cavalry? I think Larry wants you to look specifically at cavalry, as opposed to the general idea of surprise. Although, surprise or no surprise.
Right. Well, it depends on the definition of surprise and the definition of tactical surprise or strategic surprise. My take on that: strategically, yes, they were surprised. They didn't expect to fight a battle there. Tactically, in their camps, they were warned by this reconnaissance patrol, Peabody's patrol. They were warned in plenty of time that they were able to form lines of battle and fight. The specific misuse of cavalry, I think that is a definite problem. In the Union Army, the cavalry prior to Shiloh was organized on the smaller levels, brigade level, and so on. There's a vast reorganization immediately before the Battle of Shiloh in terms of artillery and cavalry, and these cavalry battalions are assigned to the division level, and they switch all around, and that adds chaos. Really, though, the cavalry, and I think this is larger than just Shiloh. Early in the war, there's a misuse of cavalry in terms of using them for couriers and escort and things like that. And no, Grant does not have his cavalry probing way out ahead of his army. So yes, that is definitely an issue. I'm not convinced that it is the main issue, though. I think the main issue that causes Grant and Sherman to be, I'll throw in Sherman there, to be surprised at Shiloh is just this vast overconfidence, and they just can't fathom the idea that the Confederates would march out of their entrenchments at Corinth and come and fight on open territory. That just doesn't enter their
No,
mind.
that's right.
And to them, Shiloh, the Pittsburgh landing area, is a staging area, not a battlefield.
That's right.
And they're going to have to go down to Corinth, just as C.F. Smith says. We're going to have to go down there and root them out like we would a badger out of a hole.
Badger out of the
You know,
hole,
we're just, this is not a battlefield. Turns out it was. It turns out it was a good battlefield in terms of terrain for them to defend and win the battle. But I think the larger, I don't know if it's overconfidence or just ignorance or naivety early in the war. That we think of Grant and Sherman as the great Grant and Sherman that won the war and so on, but the Grant and Sherman of early 1862 are vastly different than the 1864 Grants and Shermans. So they're learning through the process.
Yeah, and I think I think I agree completely. I think the earlier question too about Lincoln, that Lincoln is learning. Everybody's learning during this time, and the whole question that the whole issue is that both Grant and Sherman, I think as Tim has said, he just couldn't fathom the idea. And it makes no sense. If you think about why would the Confederates move out? In fact, it's an interesting question. Let us say, what ifs are, you can be right or wrong, but let's say the Confederates had not moved out and the Union had gathered itself and moved against Corinth. What would have happened then? Because what did happen, as we know, is that the Confederate Army was bloodied very severely, limped back to Corinth, and then over time, it took a month on Halleck's part, but they were driven out, or left actually, and Corinth was captured. And according to the doctrine of that day, to capture strategic places like that, or even tactical places like a railroad junction, in that way was what you were supposed to do, and that's exactly what the Union forces did. They captured that railroad where the railroad crossed. But it's what's fascinating to me is you were talking about Grant and Sherman, is how much time they spend after the war with other Union generals debating who did the right thing, did we do this, should we have done that, etc. What ifs or what ifs.
And indeed, they went and dug him out of Corinth like a badger out of its hole. And lo and behold, the Confederates did not throw up their hands and cry uncle because you captured our railroad.
That's right.
They continued to fight.
Yeah, right.
So you brought up Halleck. So, John, let's talk about Halleck. How did Lincoln judge or misjudge Henry W. Halleck? Yeah. Another topic, another person that you've written a biography of.
Yeah. Well, Halleck, again, has the reputation of being the great American military mind of the 19th century. After all, he wrote the book. And, people argue, well, it was just Jomini that he plagiarized from. I think it's more than that. But he really did write. He was the guy that people looked to. One of the books that Lincoln read to prepare himself was Halleck's book. But the difficulty with Halleck, and I don't want to take too much time, but the difficulty with Halleck, I think, is his psychological makeup. He's a very successful businessman, one of the wealthiest people in the United States before the war, but when it comes to being a general, he can't pull the trigger, so to speak. He can't make that movement. So I think Lincoln does find, and he keeps hoping that Halleck is going to show the talent that he believes he has, but he doesn't. And then people say, well, why didn't Lincoln replace Halleck earlier? Because there was nobody there to take his place. I don't think Grant wasn't ready. Sherman certainly wasn't ready to do it.
Well, I want to show, now that we're on the generals, I want to show a couple of artifacts. We have artifacts here at Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. Shouldn't shock you at home to know that they are for sale, and if you want to ask us about them, please give us a call. Maybe not now. If you do call now, we'll put someone else on the camera, and Dan Weinberg will run back to the phone and talk to you about them. But here are two carte visites, two CDVs of our principal commanders at Shiloh. And indeed, the Civil War represents a revolution in technology. Not just rifled muskets, but photographs as well. For the first time, photographs can be reprinted on paper, and so therefore they can be mass-produced. No longer this glass daguerreotypes. It's just a one-off thing. So here are your two commanders, Albert Sidney Johnston and U.S. Grant. U.S. Grant signed his CDV. Johnston did not sign his CDV. I would like to find a signed Johnston CDV if there's one out there. Which brings us to, let's talk about Johnston now more than Grant, Tim. Conquer or perish. Move from terrain to the leaders. I think you point out here in the book, as well as anybody ever has, Johnston is gambling.
Right.
This is a gamble. Is the gamble worth it? And was it worth trying that? Was it worth perishing for?
Well, I start to say we'd have to ask him, but that's not possible. Obviously, the way it turned out, they lost and he died. Those weren't very good results, but I tend to think, yes, it was worth it. Shiloh represents probably the best case scenario where the Confederates have a chance to turn the tide in the West. We could get into the what ifs and what if the Confederates had won at Shiloh and all that, but don't want to get into what ifs, but we can deal with reality after Shiloh, and the reality is there's not another chance that comes along where the Confederates have this much parity and equality. Now, I mentioned Chickamauga, they might have a slight advantage Chickamauga, but they'll have this much parity with the opportunities that are presented. Chickamauga by that time retaking Chattanooga and moving back into West Tennessee and into Kentucky and all that's probably not fathomable. But with Shiloh, the opportunity to turn the tide and move back into those areas that they had lost and defend them again with the idea that we're learning from our former mistakes. They're not going to get trapped in Fort Donelson again. So really, to me, Shiloh represents the best chance that the Confederacy had during the war to turn the tide in the West, and it was a gamble. From the beginning, it was a gamble, and it didn't work out.
Yeah.
And Johnson, of course, perished, but I argue that perhaps, and I don't want to say every historian says their battle is where the battle was won and lost, and I've used the example of the national parks. If picking the Revolutionary War, you go to Kings Mountain, and the interpretive signage says this is where the Revolutionary War in the Southern colonies was won, and then you go up the road to Cowpens and it says this is where the Southern colonies were, and then you go to Guilford Courthouse and it says this is where the Southern colonies were. I don't want to say that this was the when the North won the war, but it was a big step. The Confederacy took a big step in perishing itself, not just Albert Sidney Johnston, but the Confederacy too at Shiloh.
But this brings the issue too of this whole question of can of worms and all.
Yeah.
You get into the debate over Gettysburg and Vicksburg, all both happening at the same time. But I think what Tim is saying, just to add to it, is what happened at Shiloh could have been a warning call, so to speak, for the Confederacy that this area of the country was important, that it just wasn't Virginia. It just wasn't what was happening in the East. And I just believe that it's the fact that the Confederacy never recognized how important it was to control and to dominate in the West. Because what was basically happening is the Union generals, and you can talk about Grant or Sherman or whoever, but they're just rolling things up. It's almost a steady march until finally, hey, how'd these Western boys get to Virginia?
How'd they get all the way to North Carolina? Yeah. We're 30 minutes in here, and almost everything is about Shiloh, but we have a certain amount of Lincoln and Shiloh.
That's right. That's right.
And in fact, I am gonna pitch you one more Lincoln and Shiloh question.
Sure.
It's President Lincoln did have an unusual experience around the time of Shiloh with the military. He was not in Washington, or I think he was in transit from Washington to Norfolk in April, and. So about the time, just after Grant and Don Carlos Buell had won their bloodbath in Tennessee, we came as close as we can have, maybe, to having a commander-in-chief actually order an operation. Tell us about what Lincoln was doing in April of 1862.
Well, Lincoln is, and it's obviously a long story, but Lincoln is on this boat and says, we really ought to land troops here, and he lands himself and says, yeah, this is where we need to do our thing. And what's intriguing to me is that still after that, he doesn't see himself as the great military mind. He still is looking to generals. He's still trying to figure out the best way to do it. The only thing I think you could say there, and is that in that incident, Lincoln expresses something he's going to express more fully later, that you've got to move, you've got to be on the offensive, you've got to keep pressure on the other side. And that was not what was being done, because that was not what the thinking was. It simply was not what the thinking of the war was, that you do this sort of thing. You have to capture places, and really that's what he's talking about. He's talking about capturing a place at that particular time. But still, it does show that other element. You've got to move at all places at the same time, not just massing against one single area.
Right.
April 1862 is a good month for Lincoln.
Yeah,
Shiloh and Island Number 10 in the fall of New Orleans,
right?
And
and Memphis,
Memphis, well, later in just a little bit later, but I've often thought of Lincoln in his mindset of just losing his son, and in February I believe, or whenever it was, immediately after Fort Donelson, and just the roller coaster of emotions that he would have been on. It's hard to fathom.
Well, this is why I think Lincoln is such an intriguing figure, because not only because of the military side of it that we're talking about, but there's so many other elements about him, about his life, about his experiences, about his relationship with his wife, his relationship with his children, his attitude toward African Americans, which is so unique at that particular time. He's just an absolutely intriguing individual. I mean, no matter which way you look at him as a constitutional lawyer, and you see elements that you don't see in anybody else at the time. This guy really was special. It makes sense that there'd be an Abraham Lincoln bookshop, I think. Yeah.
Not a Millard Fillmore.
Not a Millard Fillmore, that's right, yeah.
Or a Jefferson Davis.
And over here, we have an engraving made at the time. This is a Civil War dated engraving, not a post-war. Otto Boddicker is one of the great printmakers of the Civil War, also a veteran. On a different print he made was a picture of Libby Prison after he'd been a prisoner there. And then he went back home after his exchange and made money on selling his drawing. But here is Sherman entering Savannah by Otto Boddicker. And this is Sherman in Savannah. It's called Sherman at Savannah, Georgia. In the background, you see the Casimir-Pulaski Monument that's famous in Savannah, and the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. But while we're looking at that, John, what is the importance of Sherman's Christmas gift? Sherman's Christmas gift, to which his note is reproduced there in the
right. Yeah. Just to back up a little bit. Yeah. Sherman writes his very famous message to Lincoln, saying, "I'm presenting you Savannah as a Christmas gift," and some ways this really just exploded his reputation around the nation. Our military Santa Claus was the response and all. But I think what's even more interesting about the Savannah thing, it comes as the culmination of the march to the sea. And what is most intriguing is, you hear of all the stories about the march and the havoc and the destruction and all march, which has been overdone, obviously. But if you look at what happens in Savannah, throughout this time, Sherman is saying, look, if the Confederacy continues battling, I will use every means at my disposal. But as soon as the Confederacy quits and we can go back to the way things were, I will become the South's best friend. Well, he really does some havoc, and so do some of the Confederates like Joe Wheeler do a lot of havoc in this march to the sea. But he gets to Savannah, and the mayor meets him outside the city with his hands up, basically, and quits. And Sherman then moves into Savannah. And if you go there today, you still see many of those same houses because very little destruction was done. They talk about how even the soldiers were purchasing food and other things at that particular time. So Savannah in many ways is a statement that when Sherman said, "I will be your best friend if you quit," was accurate. He really used the hard war, soft peace idea to keep this war moving in the Union direction.
Then one other thing in Otto Bodeker's engraving, we don't need to look at it again, but just something for our friends and colleagues that like to study the little skirmish at Gettyville in Pennsylvania. There are two people, Sherman, at the end of his most important victory. The most important victory possibly of the war up to that point is pictured there with the subordinates, flanked by General Slocum and by General Oliver Otis Howard.
Yeah.
And if you only study Gettysburg, you're going to ask yourself, how did those guys end up on the winning team of the most important?
That's a very good point. Yeah, very good point.
But that would take us off topic, and we only have so much more time. And I want to get to some of your questions. And Gene has written from Champaign. Thank you very much, Gene. And Gene has actually stolen like 3 of my questions, which is great. So I don't have to ask him now. But Tim, Gene would like to know, what is one thing that surprised you most when researching the second day of the Battle of Shiloh and that made it into this book? Thanks, Gene.
There were several things that surprised me in dealing with the second day. One, can I do more than one? One is really, I'm convinced that the Confederate Army fights really more as a cohesive unit. Maybe not as an army unit, but they obviously fight as an army. But in terms of divisions and corps, they fight more together on the second day than they do the first day, because we all know about these column of corps formation on the initial first day and how things break apart and the command and control breaks down. But really, they wind up oftentimes by happenstance and by accident. But Hardee's whole corps fights together. Hardee's not there, but Hardee's whole corps fights together. In Bragg's corps, Ruggles and Withers' divisions primarily fight together. They're not together as a corps, but the divisions fight together. Polk's corps is not that good. Breckinridge's corps fights together on the second day. None of those corps or divisions fought as a whole on the first day together. So I was really surprised at that. In a larger sense, I was surprised. I think everybody paints the second day as just a done deal. It was mopping up and so on, but there was vicious fighting on the second day, and the Confederates really fight. They put up a really vicious stand, and they stopped the Union forces really in their tracks at the first contact. Except for in part of the terrain, the battlefield is widening, and as a result, they can't cover their flanks, and Lew Wallace is able to outflank on a number of occasions this Confederate line, and that drives them back. But I was really surprised at the level of resistance that this battered, beaten, disorganized, tired, bloody Confederate Army was able to put up on the second day in the face of fresh, and that's a relative term as well. If you call Lew Wallace's 17-mile hike the day before fresh, and Buell's army's marching in and so on, but they hadn't been engaged the day before, so in that sense they are fresh. But the level of resistance and stopping power they put in front of those fresh units surprised me as well.
Okay.
Could I ask Tim a question too?
Go right ahead.
Because this, I think he's hit something that we like to joke, and Civil War historians like to joke, and other people joke, is that there isn't a soldier in the Civil War who hasn't got 3 books written about him, or every battle's got 82 books, and yet I think he's right that the second day there's practically nothing on. I mean, everybody's well then. Why do you think that? What's the reason behind that?
I'm not sure. I think the mindset forever has been that the battle was won and lost on the first day, and it was, there was no getting away from the first day that it was a Union victory. And actually, I argue that it was not the first day. I think Grant puts himself in a position to win on the first day, but as we talked about today, he could have thrown that away by retreating or falling back or something. So I think the real key to Grant winning at Shiloh is made during the night when he chooses to stay. When the accounts are that Buell is saying retreat and Buell denies it, and what really happened we don't know. But McPherson actually says, think about retreat. Sherman, of course, comes to him and is thinking retreat, and he blurts out, "We've had the devil's own day," and Grant says, "Lick them tomorrow." So I think that's the real decision that achieves the victory, and then how much of a victory is determined on the second day. I think another part of it has to do with the sources. If you read the Shiloh reports and the official records, the first day is very articulate in all of them. We went to this field and we stopped by this cabin and so on, and even somewhat in the night they'll talk about different efforts and so on. But you get to the second day and it's all just chaos. You can't tell what field, what anything they're talking about, and it just breaks down into just almost mind-numbing minutia that you can't tell anything about. So I think that's a lot of the reason too, that it's hard to pick out.
Yeah.
And we've got the level of detail in this book on the second day matching the first day, but it's not. You can't pinpoint quite as many things and what battery was taken, and that's the exact same thing that the original Park Commission, Major Reed, the Park historian, was not able to determine from the reports and even from the veteran testimony exactly where maybe certain things happened on the second day, and as a result, there are a lot less second day markers on the battlefield than there are first days, because if he couldn't verify it, he didn't put a marker.
Right.
Very good.
So the sourcing and so on probably.
We've talked about that sometimes at Shiloh. Doing Shiloh programs, sometimes we have a bias towards stuff we know.
Sure, right.
Sure. And we leave out stuff that we don't know.
Yep.
Thank you. You're responding to my challenge to send in questions. Everybody is sending in questions. We have a lot of them. I'm going to try to get to as many as you as possible. If I don't get to your question, thank you for submitting it. I'm sorry we didn't get to you, but thank you. Shane has sent a couple of questions from Memphis, and Collierville is where. And Shane clearly gets out to the battlefield a lot because he likes terrain, and he's asking a couple of questions about terrain. So I'm going to give him both the questions to you real quickly. One is, do you feel like these ravines have changed because of erosion in 152 years? The geography of. And I'm going to give you the other question before we.
Okay.
And the other one is, Shane wonders if the swampy pond that we call Water Oaks Pond at the crossroads, if you think there's any chance that might have been what people were referring to as Bloody Pond at the time, and not the basin over by the peach orchard.
The changes in terrain, obviously the effects of erosion and rainfall and so on are going to change it a little bit. I'm no geographer or geologist or whatever with that, and I can't imagine it being that much different. You might have a foot of erosion or a couple of feet or something, but it's not going to change things substantially. Yeah. Where there was a ravine then, there's a ravine now. In terms of Water Oaks Pond, I'm not sure that would have been the Bloody Pond, because the account that we have of the Bloody Pond, really the only one, is what's the guy's name? Thomas Walker, I think, a civilian, comes by on the Tuesday after the battle and talks about how this pond was filled with blood and so on, and he pinpoints that for the commission later on. So the thing about Bloody Pond and Water Oaks Pond, and we think, gosh, there were two ponds at the battlefield, but there were numerous wet weather ponds and so on. And the fact that one of them is Bloody Pond, I've got just tons of material, April 1862 material, that says this spring was brackish, this spring was flowing with blood, or there was a dead Confederate bleeding in this creek, and there's blood all in this water source and so on. My beef, I guess, with the Bloody Pond, I don't doubt that there was a pond there, and I don't doubt that it was bloody. But the fact that it gets all the attention, because the commission, the Park Commission in 1895, nailed a board up to a tree beside the Bloody Pond that said Bloody Pond, and it became
all those stories,
ever since. But there were many bloody areas, but I'm not sure that Water Oaks Pond would have been Bloody Pond. I don't know that that's accurate.
John, we have a question from Norval in Louisville, and since from this whole pile of questions, one came in for John, but there is somebody out there that wants to talk about Lincoln and the military.
That's good.
But Norval in Louisville, thank you, Norval, wants to ask you, how did how did you pare Lincoln and the military down to 168 pages? It's the topic of the whole war.
Yeah, right.
And so this could have been a much more in-depth study.
It could, yeah, it very much so. And
Thanks, Mel.
the main reason was that this series was set up this way to be brief books that modern readers who may not have the time to spend a whole lot of time reading, a 1,000-page book or whatever, might sit down and read this. But the other thing I could jokingly say, Sylvia Rodriguez, our esteemed editor, wouldn't tolerate anything longer than that. So that had something. No, seriously, it was difficult. It was difficult to cut down, but what I had to do is keep that in my mind as I was working on this, that it had to be brief, it had to be succinct. And I think in some ways, as I used to tell former graduate students, and this guy would know
this is my mentor.
Yeah, but that you have to, sometimes we all write too much and we have to cut back. Well, in this case, I knew it had to be brief, and so I had that in my mind all along.
Okay, and we're I want to look at another piece of artifact here, because it's a Lincoln artifact, and I want to show our man's hand, if I can. But John, this is a really interesting endorsement that Lincoln writes, and you see it's a beautiful endorsement, and it's got the seal on there. The folks at home can see it, and it's Abraham Lincoln writes. It's an endorsement card signed A. Lincoln, attached to an autographed letter signed by Montgomery Meigs, the Quartermaster General of the Army, and Lincoln orders Meigs. I'm going to go ahead and read it. Quartermaster General, please give the bearer, Mr. Foster, a pass to New Bern, North Carolina. This is 15 August 1862. So it's August 18. Please give him a pass to New Bern, North Carolina. Meigs then writes, all quartermasters will respect the request to the president on the card attached, and he signs it. Charles H. Foster, interesting guy, a North Carolina Unionist who thought he was going to organize in 1862 a regiment of North Carolina Unionists, and that they'd all gather there. And one thing that we know about Foster, he was an unconditional Union candidate and from North Carolina under a provisional state government, which later collapsed. On August 31st, 1861, Lincoln wrote to Simon Cameron, respectfully submitted to the War Department with the remark that if arms are in the hands of a Union regiment in North Carolina, they probably would not remain in their hands for very long. And then one contemporary later wrote about Foster, Foster should be at once arrested, for he continues in the course of fraud and deception. So I'm not going to ask you to comment on Foster.
Yeah,
But here, Lincoln, 1862, the North Carolina problem, bringing military, the Southern Unionists in the military.
Yeah, the Unionist thing is a major thing in Lincoln's way of thinking. He throughout, I mean, almost to the end of the war, he's thinking in terms, but certainly at the beginning, he's thinking in terms of, there's just a lot of these Unionists there. We just got to reach them. We got to support them. We've got to give them help. The majority of Southern people don't want to see this war gone. They'll quit if we can just reach to them. Well, I think that was a mistake. I think Lincoln did not understand the depth of feeling in the Confederacy in regard to this particular war. So the result is that his attempt to reach out to Unionists never really works.
Although certainly each of the Confederate states
did provide
at least one unit.
Yeah, that's right.
Of white Unionist people.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think too, you run into a lot of different things why people are Unionists. Tim wrote an excellent book on the home front in Mississippi during the war, and one of the things is, why do people stay with the Union, or why do people stay with the Confederacy? And what's interesting, sometimes it just depends, as he knows, just depends which army is right near there. If it's a Confederate, I'm a Confederate. If it's Union Army, I'm a Union person. And if you really want to see something interesting, is to read some of the stuff that comes into the federal government after the war. where people are asking the Claims
Yeah.
Commission. I mean, everybody was a Unionist. The South was overrun with Unionists.
Well, I have a question here from another one for Tim. So people do like Shiloh.
They do like
people
Shiloh.
like Lincoln, but this is their chance to talk about Shiloh. So it's a three-part question, but there's a couple of good ones to think about. Tim, can you share with us a few things you discovered that you didn't know before researching this book? And also, the artillery line above Dill Branch at the end of the first day was commanded by a person from Lake Forest, Illinois.
Webster, Colonel Webster.
Yeah.
Oh.
He asked true or false. The answer is true, Colonel Webster.
Yeah.
And then he says he visited Shiloh at April 6th at 5 a.m. And you and Bjorn were guiding a program.
And one of those hikes.
And Bjorn was singing. And that it's a great memory. Well,
maybe you should sing Shiloh Hill.
Yeah, sing Battle of Shiloh Hill here. Yeah.
I'm really sorry you didn't invite me to that. That would have been worth it. Yeah.
Everybody is invited to 5 a.m. at Fraley Field on the 6th of April every year. Someone might sing. But let's get to the other part of the question. Anything particularly interesting that was new that surprised you?
Well, I've already talked a little bit about the second day things,
Mm-hmm.
the cohesion of the Confederate Army. Now, that doesn't mean by any means that they're completely reorganized. That's not the fact. And the fact that they're able to put up that much of a fight on the second day. I would have to sit and think. I think one of the things is the disorganization in really both Union and Confederate armies on the eve of battle. Even as the Confederate Army is deploying, they're switching brigade commanders and regiments among brigades, and there's just massive disorganization. Gibson's brigade, for instance, is out in front of the Confederate Army on picket duty, if you want to call it that, at Monterey. And as the Second Corps, Bragg's Corps, is marching through, they see their corps coming through, and Gibson blurts out to Bragg, and Johnston is sitting right there, "What's going on?" And Johnston says, "Bragg, you didn't send him word that the Army is moving forward to attack?" And Gibson says, "I didn't know anything about it." And Bragg hostily looks at Gibson like, "You're in trouble, boy." And of course, we know the story between Gibson and Bragg then, and a lot of it, I think, goes back to that. So a lot of little interesting tidbits like that I found out.
We've been having a great time. We only have like 5 minutes left, and I have a fair amount of chores to do. But I want to throw at least one more question for each of you. First, I'm going to go to John. How is Mississippi dealing with the presence of the U.S. Grant Association
Very good.
and the U.S. Grant Presidential Library project that's coming up?
Well, actually, very, very well. We've been welcomed really with open arms. As you know, it was a very difficult issue to leave Southern Illinois University and come to Mississippi State University. And people, again, like we talked about, Chief Justice Frank Williams played a major role of leadership in having that happen, and 3 different Mississippi State presidents, the dean of the Mississippi State Libraries, all did work to get this way. But when people ask us that question, and we get a lot of questions from the media, national media and all, we like to point out that it was fated, absolutely a question of fate, that the Grant Presidential Library would come to Mississippi State and to Mississippi, because during the Virginia campaign, Lincoln said to Grant, he told him to hold on with a bulldog grip. And of course, Mississippi State, as everybody knows, with the great football team, are the Bulldogs. So consequently, there was no thing.
Grant is a bulldog.
Right. And as our president so eloquently, Mark Keenum so eloquently puts it, without Mississippi, nobody had ever heard of Grant. He's thinking of Vicksburg, of course.
Very true. But it's I want to give a a nod of thanks to this whole project of the U.S. Grant Papers.
Yes.
A project started by the one-time Abraham Lincoln Bookshop stock boy.
That's right. Yes.
John Y. Simon. Who later moved it he made it a thing there in Southern Illinois University. And then, and so I think it has landed in good hands and in a beautiful place, in a good place, with very hospitable neighbors. They're nice people in Mississippi.
Yeah, well,
Tim's from Mississippi.
That's right.
Yeah.
He's from Mississippi. That's
right. And Tim, I don't have time to ask you your last question. So we'll just assume that Lew Wallace was lost on the first day and he totally messed up the second day. Unless you have some comment about either of those topics.
You can read the book to get
You can read the book to find out if Tim thinks that Lew Wallace was lost or that he did badly on the second day.
I would like to say hello to Kelly, Mary Kate, and Lee Grace, though. We got a message from them.
God,
those are my girls at home.
Oh,
thank you
that's
to
great.
our fans in Adamsville, Tennessee.
Yes, yes.
Also want to announce, or maybe I'll let you announce or discuss the upcoming, forthcoming books from Southern Illinois University Press, a series that you are editing together, The World of Ulysses S. Grant. Tell us what we have in store with that.
Yes, as you know, we talked about what John Y. Simon did with the 32 volumes of the Grant Papers. Well, we're going to follow up on this and have a series of Grant monographs covering various aspects of Grant's life and service and success, and it is through Southern Illinois University Press. Tim and I are the co-editors. We've got a wonderful board of advisors, and so I look for, well, it's going to be in March. Our first book is going to be coming out on the best of Grant's writings, taking the key things out of the 32 volumes, and then our second volume is going to be really a path-breaking book on the role that Grant played on his world tour, where he was actually setting foreign policy, really forewarning or coming into being of the open door policy in American diplomacy. So there's a lot of good things like that are going to happen. And what's happening is, and thanks to John Y. Simon and his work, the attitude toward Grant has changed 300 degrees or whatever it would be.
180.
180. Yeah, we'll add a couple.
We had Joan Waugh on the program a few years ago, so she had that terrific book on the memory of
excellent book. Yeah.
So we're looking forward to these books from Southern Illinois University Press, The World of Ulysses S. Grant, edited by John F. Marszalek and Timothy B. Smith. And I'm going to put the two of you to work. We have some books here.